Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to SF Commons. Tonight, we have a very special show.
Under my understanding, the Capitol Police is not able to confiscate members' equipment when the member is not under investigation. It is their equipment, and it's supposed to be returned.
Well, I think there's extenuating circumstances in this case, and I think that working through my counsel and the necessary personnel, if that in fact is the case, and with the permission of through the investigation, then we'll return the equipment. But until that's accomplished, I can't return the equipment.
I think you're violating the rules when you conduct your business that way, and should expect that there would be consequences.
Passed away suddenly when I was 10 years old, and my mom was a young widow with 3 young children. We were 12, 10, and 9 at the time. So my mother went from working part-time to working full-time so that she could keep us in the same house. We relied on her income, her salary, as well as Social Security survivors benefits. So when people talk about Social Security, I know exactly how important it is for families when they have to deal with very unforeseen crises. My mom was I'm now a professor of law and public finance at Nova Southeastern University in Fort Lauderdale. And during this time, I wrote an awful lot. I've got quite a paper trail, you can say,
Right.
On my scholarship and public writings that go really back to the early 1980s, where I was critical of financial deregulation in the early 1980s and carried that line of analysis all the way through to present day. I was critical of Alan Greenspan in the 1990s before it was very popular to be. It felt like I was Chicken Little for a while, warning about a financial collapse, and nobody was really listening to folks like me who were warning about what was going to come of this kind of deregulation of Wall Street. So many millions of other people feel, which was a profound frustration with our politics and the way our politicians are really pretty much bought and paid for. And I had written about that as a scholar. I had written about the campaign finance system, and I never thought I was going to run for an office. And over the years, I must say that every now and then somebody would say, Tim, you should be in Congress. You should be running for office. We need people like you. And I would laugh at it. I'm not a man with a lot of means. As a professor, you don't make a fortune. I don't have personal wealth to put into a race.
Right, exactly.
And last year, I certainly I caught the fever, you could say, like millions of other people did, who wanted change in this country and progressive change. And I realized, well, my local congresswoman was a big part of the problem in this country. And it was clear to me and to millions of others that she was trying to keep the Bernie Sanders campaign down in a very illegitimate way. As head of the Democratic National Committee, she should have been completely neutral. And it was clear she was not being neutral. And I used to say during the campaign that if I was elected, I was bought and paid for, but I'd be bought and paid for by the American people.
Well, let me ask you something with regards to this class action lawsuit, right?
That lawsuit is a class action lawsuit.
Exactly.
Brought by people who contributed money to the Bernie Sanders.
I contributed a lot, so I want my money back.
Yeah, me too. I contributed a number of times, small donations each time.
Right.
And the DNC lawyers and Debbie Wasserman Schultz's lawyers, like you said, they made the argument that the DNC does not have to comply with its bylaws. The bylaws say that the DNC should be completely neutral and impartial during the presidential nominating process. I think as a matter of law, it's a very bad argument. You take a look at corporations. Corporations are legally required to abide by their own bylaws.
Now, what are the issues there? It's a blue-collar type district.
Well, it varies quite a bit, actually.
Oh, really?
It starts along the beach Surfside, Sunny Isle, some wealthy areas, right up to Hollywood Beach, where I live, in Dania Beach. And that gets to be more working class and middle income, lower income. As somebody who's been teaching at a university for more than 20 years now, I feel like I do have a pretty good finger on the pulse as to the kinds of issues that a lot of my constituents here are facing. I see it through the eyes of my law students. I know the kinds of problems they have and their families have. And, you know, my students, let's just start off with university students all over the country, including here in South Florida. The costs of higher education are high.
Exactly.
Many of them are going deeply in debt, and they're paying relatively high interest rates when you think of the Wall Street banks pay 1% or less still,
Exactly.
and my students are paying 7, 8, or 9%.
10%
And
even. Compounding interest, yeah.
Yeah, and then they're graduating. It's a tough, tough labor market.
Exactly.
And I think that's the biggest issue that folks here are facing. But along with the lack of jobs and good paying jobs, there's poverty in South Florida. There's a couple of 100,000 senior citizens living below the poverty line. There is a healthcare crisis here, like everywhere else. There's an environmental crisis. We talk about climate change and rising sea levels. Well, come to South Florida, where rising sea levels is not something theoretical. And it's not just flooding of the coastal communities. We also see the beginning of saltwater intrusion into our aquifer, which is the Biscayne aquifer. If that continues in time, the drinking supply in South Florida is going to be very much in jeopardy. You go further up the coast outside of my district, and there's this rather large lake, Lake Okeechobee, and it should naturally drain into the Everglades, where the water would be filtered, it would replenish our aquifer, but it's not able to drain because there are very large sugar farms owned by the largest sugar companies in the world. And instead, the water gets diverted to the east and west coast of Florida, creating these toxic algae tides. We've got a 515-mile pipeline, the Sable Trail pipeline, that's being constructed. If it is completed, and it might be completed as early as this summer, it will be pumping over 1 billion cubic feet of fracked gas a day through the upper Floridan aquifer, which provides 60% of the state's drinking water.
So it's poisoning the water system then?
Well, a study just came out from the Natural Resources Defense Council 2 days ago showing that the problem in Flint, Michigan is really quite widespread. And it ranked all the states in the country, and it shows that 77 million Americans are basically dealing with contaminated water, contaminated with lead, arsenic, and other toxic chemicals. And Florida is ranked second in the country, second worst in the country. So these are big problems. The Natural Resource Defense Council report said it's really from two reasons for these water problems. First is the cop on the beat. The Environmental Protection Agency has not been doing its job. The Congress has not been funding it properly. Regulators are not getting the support they need and the funding they need to be a good cop on the beat and to enforce the kind of environmental laws, the Clean Water Act that we have. And the second problem is that we're all living on borrowed time with a deteriorating infrastructure. So these are big problems that we have to address. As a legal scholar, I've written a lot about public finance, infrastructure banks, the central bank, and I've written for many years about how we need to have a national infrastructure bank, and the Federal Reserve needs to support it so that we have the resources to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure. We can't just do it by going to the bond markets, because take a look at the interest rates that state and local governments are paying on the bond markets.
So let's talk about the student loans, right? I mean, because there's trillions of dollars on the student loans.
That said, for 18 to 34-year-olds in this country, they're more likely to be living at home with their parents than living on their own and starting their own families. The burdens are tremendous. It seems to me very much like a lost generation. People who graduate with college degrees are very underemployed. looking around for some kind of a career. And a lot of folks go to grad school, hoping that'll be the answer. They graduate from grad schools, law schools, for instance, and it's a tough job market as well. So there's a lot that has to be done. It seems to me like a lost generation. We started by talking about my father. You know, that greatest generation, and they're called the greatest generation because they survived World War II. But before they were the greatest generation, it was a lost generation as well. They lived through the Great Depression, and it was the New Deal that put 11 million Americans back to work in public sector jobs programs. Right. That's what we need for this generation. We need a very reinvigorated jobs program. I would say, why not look at the New Deal as a model? A civilian conservation corps, which during the New Deal employed 3 million young men, and 80% of their paychecks went back to help support their parents. And a civilian conservation corps for our day should be clearing underbrush and preventing these fires. Every summer we see
or a VISTA program.
We should have a Works Projects Administration. You know, Ronald Reagan's father and his brother were employed during the Great Depression working for the WPA, and the WPA built much of this nation's infrastructure. And I'm not just talking about roads and bridges and airports and seaports, but hospitals and schools as well, and a lot of roads. So there's plenty that the public sector can do and should be doing. And when we take a look at the cost of higher education, my dad, after World War II, his whole generation got a GI Bill of Rights. And that GI Bill of Rights gave tuition-free higher education to 16 million returning veterans from World War II. They were eligible for this higher education. And it wasn't just tuition-free higher education, it was living stipends at the same time. And if you didn't want to go to college or university, you had small business loans at very low interest rates. You had low interest mortgage loans. You had health benefits. This is the kind of investment we need to make in the future, and we're not making it.
Well, and how about the student loans itself? How could, you know, like right now there's some kind of forgiveness programs, but I don't know how effective they are, and they're just like, people will be dead before they make a dent on these loans. I mean, that's what it is. So, you know, what can the federal government do to just like wipe out these loans?
Well, I write about the Federal Reserve, and you know, the Federal Reserve, its response to the 2008 financial crash was really a very aggressive response. Right. It gave tens of trillions of dollars of low interest loans. I'm talking about like 0.25% interest rates to Wall Street banks and hedge funds and foreign banks and foreign central banks. And it didn't do that for Main Street. Exactly. During the Great Depression of the 1930s and into the 1940s, the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks made hundreds of millions of dollars of low interest loans to small businesses. That could be happening. And, you know, in 2011, Senator Bernie Sanders had appointed me to a special advisory committee on reforming the Federal Reserve. It was an advisory committee that included a number of really great economists like Joseph Stiglitz and James Galbraith and Robert Reich. And this was one of the things that I spoke about during that time and that I studied. The Fed could be doing an awful lot more. The Fed also purchased over $3 trillion in mortgage-backed securities from these Wall Street firms, from these Wall Street banks. Why can't the Fed buy up a lot of the student debt and help refinance it at very low interest rates? Low interest rates. For that matter, it could buy up the debt, it could hold it on its books, and basically forgive it, and the world would not come crashing down. The dollar would remain strong, I'm sure. That these payday lenders have preyed on the poorest folks.
Of course, yeah.
Quite often minority communities, and they have trapped people in a cycle of debt. And, you know, folks go to them because they don't have other alternatives, and we need to create other alternatives, such as postal banking. Again,
that's exactly an excellent idea. Bernie Sanders was talking about that.
Sure. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and I've been writing about it for years. I call it the public option in banking. And back in 2010, 2011, I wrote a piece that the New America Foundation had published called The Public Option in Banking. So these payday lenders here in Florida are really exploiting poor people and struggling working folks. And I looked at Wasserman Schultz's record. She was actually pushing a Republican bill in Congress that would have prevented the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the federal bureau created by the Dodd-Frank Act. Her Republican bill would have prevented that bureau from regulating payday lenders in this country for, I think, a 2-year period. And at the same time, she had taken over, I think, $67,000 in campaign contributions from the payday lending industry, and she had taken hundreds of thousands of dollars from the big Wall Street banks that fund these payday lenders. Yeah, I've been for Medicare for All for years. I want a single-payer system in this country. Right. Wasserman Schultz was just recently asked about this, and she said that she doesn't support the Medicare for All bill that was introduced by Representative John Conyers in the House of Representatives. Yeah, right. And her rationale was that we have to fix Obamacare first and defend Obamacare. I don't see how supporting Medicare for All is inconsistent with trying to stop the Republicans from repealing Obamacare. It's providing a better alternative than the Republicans have. Now, the reason Wasserman Schultz, of course, and many Democrats, I'm sorry to say, do not support a Medicare for All, I believe, is because they've been taking an awful lot of money from big private health insurance companies,
right,
and also big pharmaceutical companies as well. Wasserman Schultz has been swimming in that money. She's also a drug warrior. She has said that marijuana is a gateway drug. She supported a private immigration detention center in our state, in this district, I should say. In the state, Florida has one of the highest percentages of private prisons in the country. This war on drugs falls on the backs of poorer folks, mostly on brown and black folks, on African American, Hispanic, and Native American, young men and young women, and it is completely unfair. We should not be locking folks up for using the same drugs, I say, that the last 3 American presidents, it seems, have used in their lifetimes. It is this drug war is enforced in a very discriminatory fashion, and it's very sad to see private corporate interests pushing this drug war.
Exactly.
The inequality in wealth and income is the kinds of levels of inequality that you see in banana republics. The structure of the American economy, it's not a real free market capitalist economy anymore. Exactly. In industry after industry, it looks more like crony capitalism, where just a few giant corporations dominate the marketplace. They've got their political protectors in Washington. There's no antitrust enforcement. We should be breaking up big banks. We should be regulating these huge enterprises, and we should be prosecuting when there's wrongdoing. One of the frustrations that I expressed at the time, many times, was that the Justice Department, since the financial crisis, never prosecuted any of the big bankers. You saw President Obama's first Attorney General, Eric Holder, who made excuses for the bankers, never prosecuted them, and then ended up leaving the Justice Department to become a top partner. The American people are just tired of this. It violates the rule of law when you have 2 different systems of law. For ordinary folks, you know, they could face prosecution and all kinds of collateral consequences from anything from, you know, minor drug use to, you know, anything else, any other kinds of legal infractions. But if you've got means, apparently you can rip off the American people and get away with it just because you're well-heeled and you can afford to influence leading politicians in Washington.
10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They've just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments."
And obviously, this is just a crazy strategy. We're fighting ISIS in Iraq. We're supporting ISIS. We try to say it's not ISIS. We're supporting freedom fighters in Syria. And you know, listen, if the Assad regime were just to crumble, you would think at this point we would have learned our lesson that, especially in the Middle East, we should not be having regime change where we overthrow secular regimes. Secular regimes are only going to be replaced by regimes that are funded by the Saudis, this Wahhabi radicalism, and it opens up, you could say, a space also for Islamic radicals that are funded by Iran. You know, you take a look at that region, and there's been a civil war going on within Islam now.
It's perpetual war for the last, what, 12 years?
Yeah. And it's between the Sunnis and the Shiites. And, you know, I said this during my campaign, that we need to start talking about a general disarmament in that region and really globally. The arms manufacturers and traders are just getting rich on bloodshed throughout the world. You could look 100 years into the past, and there were disarmament conferences. And they didn't work out because they weren't well enforced and because a Great Depression led to the rise of fascism all over the world. But that's the road we have to go down. We need to redirect the arms dealers, the arms manufacturers, to some other productive enterprises. I say let's rebuild the space program. Let them have their cost-plus contracts, fire their missiles into space, try to figure out a way to explore space and build on the gains from the 1960s and 1970s, but to stop this trade in armaments that is creating such bloodshed and grief throughout the world.
Exactly.
We had so much support where you are, in the Bay Area, really all along the West Coast of the United States. We had so many supporters. And, you know, most of the supporters were donating online. Every now and then we'd get, you know, envelopes in the mail with checks of $10, $15, $5, you know, with handwritten notes. And, you know, I got to tell you, it was always very touching to read people saying, I don't have a lot of money, I wish I had more, but here's $5, and keep fighting. And, you know, I'm from the grassroots.
We're delighted, and we will be watching Tim Canova. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us, and good night.